Terrific. Thank you. Welcome back. Joining me now is our panel of experts for a conversation on investing in and deploying renewable energy across America. Andy Marsh is the CEO of Plug Power, a provider of clean hydrogen and zero-emission fuel cell solutions. Steph Spears is the CEO of Solstice, a startup. I love Solstice because I'm going to get into this in a minute, but I mean, startup that emphasizes accessible solar energy. But if you have, a very weird roof and you can't get solar energy on it, you need Solstice. That's what I'm going to say. And Frank Getman is the CEO of Great Bay Renewables, which provides capital to renewable energy projects. Welcome to you all. I'm just going to give you the country and say fix it, okay? But let me just start because, Andy, so many times today, hydrogen has come up. And there's very issues as you sort of think about the realities and the mathematical equation, both of the energy profile in America, you look at jobs, you look at what our climate targets are, et cetera, and you've got certain realities. Everybody said hydrogen is a inflection transition point, but I had a talk recently with the CEO of General Electric, who's right with you, but he said, we don't have the infrastructure we need. So what are your thoughts? What are you doing to fix that?
Well, thank you for having me today. So Plug Power started actually create the first commercial market for fuel cells. Interesting, you were talking about logistics. It actually went into forklift trucks for Amazon and Walmart. And we actually delivered about 30% of retail food for folks during the pandemic.
Wow.
But we've made a commitment to build the first green hydrogen network across the United States. We're partnering with renewable energy partners like Brookfield and Apex. We announced that we have a 45-ton green hydrogen plant being put in place in upstate New York, being fed with hydropower. For your listeners, 45 tons a day is like 90,000 gallons of gasoline, just to kind of give people a perspective.
Wow.
By the end of this year, we'll have 120 tons of projects under development in California, in Texas, in Georgia, all across the states. And we have a leading electrolyzer technology, which is able to take the renewable electricity and create hydrogen. And so our goal, and we got a $5 billion balance sheet, we're committed to building out this network and serving our customers like Amazon and Walmart and others with green hydrogen.
So let me ask you a loaded question. If you have Jeff Bezos, do you need Joe Biden? Do you need to be in the infrastructure bill?
It certainly will make things a lot easier. The infrastructure bill has in it a 30% tax credit, ITC extension for the next 10 years, which I think is critical to all renewables to really build out and meet the climate goals of Paris. Additionally, with credits for green hydrogen, which people like Senator Heinrich and the Biden administration are talking about, I think there's a large opportunity to really accelerate green hydrogen, not only to help industries like mobility, but steel manufacturing, concrete manufacturing, things which are not nearly as sexy as power and transportation, but carbon footprint is equal to mobility. So the president's work certainly can help us.
Steph, you're in a space that I find fascinating, and well before you got to our screen today, you've been, highlighted as one of Elle's, Women Entrepreneur of the Year, Inc. magazine's female founders of 100. You've been out, but you've also worked in the policy space. You've worked internationally, and I've always been intrigued, so that we don't become so U.S. centric about, what are the best and promising practices abroad that we could learn from, or what are we doing well that can go, what's replicable? And so as you kind of look at your world, which is to bring solar accessibility into the market. I'm just sort of interested in what lessons are out there we ought to be aware of.
Yeah, it's a great question. And community solar, which is the type of solar that Solstice works on, is actually pulling from some of the lessons that we've seen abroad around solar microgrids and placing the generation of power closer to the communities that are enjoying that power.
So
and the more decentralized that our grid gets, the more resilient we are to climate change's effects. The other thing that is in the infrastructure bill, which we were just talking about, that we need in this country, that we can take from other countries' lessons, is around having a more centralized grid infrastructure system that is modernized, that we need to take our grid infrastructure into the 21st century rather than leaving the technology in the 19th and 20th centuries. So these are really important elements that we can learn from our lessons abroad and bring back home to kind of lead the way in this transition to clean energy.
So just so I understand, Steph, so is that distributed, because again, going back, because my lingo is not up to your folks' standard, but on the issue of distributed energy and solar at homes, is that a different construct that I remember talking to Jerry Brown about in California years ago from what you're talking about with community microgrids, or is that the same?
No, just it's similar. Distributed generation applies to generation of electricity that's outside of the framework of just centralized fossil fuel power plants. So you can have distributed generation, meaning the electricity generation is closer to communities. It doesn't have to be centralized in a giant power plant. You can have distributed generation in the form of rooftop solar on people's homes. You could have solar microgrids where people are directly plugged into a community system. You could have community solar where the electricity flows back to the grid, but participants can enjoy it even if they can't put solar on their home. And storage is also an element of distributed generation, and this idea that we don't have to have centralized power generation anymore. We can democratize access to power and decentralize power. But in order to do that, in order to transition to this green future, we need our grid infrastructure to be better. We need it to have different regions of the country's grids talk to each other better, manage our supply and demand of electricity. We saw the downsides of when we don't do that well in Texas just a little while ago. And so this is all about having modernized, centralized grid, but decentralized electricity generation.
Totally fascinating world. Well, Frank, I've been trying to get my head around what Great Bay Renewables does. It sounds to me like a little bit of wind, a little bit of solar, and a lot of money and rebates and finance. So can you tell us, because one of the things I'm very aware of, in whether we're talking about what Andy just shared or Steph said, is that the financing dimension and how you move the resources is really vital to getting scale. And I'm wondering what rabbits up your hat you have on this. I mean, how and can you explain it to our audience in a way that I can understand it?
Absolutely, and thanks. That's a great question. So basically, we've reached a tipping point in renewables where it's the lowest cost form of generation. If you're not building renewables now to meet new demand for new capacity, you're not making an economic decision anymore. So we passed that tipping point. On top of that, there's this insatiable demand from electrification of everything for renewables. And there's been massive innovation on the technology front where we've had 80, 90% plus reductions in the costs and the efficiencies going up and up and up on wind turbines and solar panels and battery storage. But there's been very little, if any, innovation on the financing front. And that's what we're about. We're looking at it, and we've teamed up with Apollo. It's a 50% owner, and a public company in Canada, Altius Renewable Royalties, is the other 50% owner of my company, Great Bay Renewables. And we're bringing royalty financing, which has been used for hundreds of years in oil and gas. It's been used for 40 years in mining and precious metals. And we're bringing this type of financing to the renewable space because we're using the same project finance structures that I used when I started in this business 20 years ago. But the market has changed, but the way we're financing these projects hasn't recognized and changed and adapted with that. And so what we're doing is bringing a new and innovative, proven form of financing to the renewable sector, and we're getting great adoption. Apex, I heard Apex mentioned is one of our partners. Tri Global Energy. So we have top tier developers who have signed up and said, hey, this is a better way to finance the development of these projects.
You just heard Steph Spears speak about Solstice and community solar farms and infrastructure in the grid, and Andy is moving food and products and all this stuff during COVID for some of the biggest countries in America, firms in America. Would a royalty structure help them, or is their world separate from where you are?
No, absolutely. We're talking to community solar developers now who they're looking for new forms of capital. And innovative forms of kind of more aligned partner-like capital. We take a long-term perspective. We earn our return over the life of these projects. We're not looking to get in and out in a short period of time. So we're taking a long-term view. And I think that they're finding that really, really attractive. So yeah, it would definitely be any form of renewable energy. We do anything associated with renewable energy.
You know, Andy, I don't know if that appeals to you. It sounds like you're going pretty quickly. Maybe you've got, other sides of this. But, I find on the renewable side, kind of when you look at these questions, and again, I think tomorrow or the next day, I'm going to be interviewing Dan Yergin and his book, The New Map. And if you read the book, he's very fair. I mean, he brings in, he sort of talks about, shale. He talks about the transportation and energy infrastructure where we're at. He talks about the Paris Climate Accords and targets and, lays out where some of that, those games are. And I guess my question is, as big and as robust as I hear the renewable sectors is growing and what there are, I also, had no idea how big the energy world is. And I keep wondering, at what point would we get to say 40% is renewables, which, a lot of people may not know. That would be huge. I think, it depends people. So, just ask all three of you, do you have a sense that the dynamics are such that they say in our lifetimes, we're going to see, say, 50-50 between renewables and other fossils? Andy?
Well, my lifetime may be shorter than some of the other people on this panel, but I actually, when I look at the world, I was fortunate enough to start working in the wireless industry in 1982. If you would have ever told me that 40 years later, the wireline network would be done and gone, I think I would not have believed you. But, there's additional value that comes from renewables that maybe people don't see. People always just look at the carbon issue. I look at the subject of electrification in general. The world's going to go electric. Electrification makes everything simpler. And if you think about the mobility world, smart cars are going to be more cost effective if it's renewable. Carbon footprint is going to reduce. What you're able to do with things like, you think about electric aircraft, and people may think I'm dreaming, but if you think about regional flights, and Plug just made an investment in a regional company developing fuel cells for that. If you live in Albany, New York area like I do, and you ride propelled planes all the time, a nice smooth jet ride is what you get with electrification. And I think that to answer your question directly, I think it's going to happen much quicker than the world may think. And I could see 50% of the world being renewable by 2035, 2040, and I will be alive then.
Wow. Steph, your thoughts on the same subject, and along these lines, because I know that you have this fantastic international background, former policy director at the NSC and whatnot. Is the United States, how do I say it? Are we lagging or are we leading?
We're not the best in the world, but that doesn't mean that we can't get there very soon. We're in the midst of a fourth industrial revolution when we're talking about how we're changing the way we get our electricity. And the way we get our electricity hasn't really changed that much in the last century, but it will change drastically in this next decade. And the reason why I say we're not currently the best is because Europe is an example. In 2020, for the first time in the history of Europe, they generated more of their power from renewables than from fossil fuels. They got 38% of their power from renewables and 37% of their power over the course of 2020 from fossil fuels. So this is the future. We are living in it. We are at an inflection point. A lot's going to change in the next 5-10 years, but it depends on us implementing policy solutions that incentivize the research and development that we need to get more technologies like renewables, storage, hydrogen fuels, and carbon capture even to get past our current status of business as usual. Just because we've done some things the way that we have for the last century does not mean that it can't change drastically.
No, that's fascinating. Frank, I'm going to ask you a last question, because I know you're a numbers guy, finance guy. One of the, I think, big questions out there, I used to do trade, and people would say, with this many exports is this many jobs, or the trade deficit is this many laws. We have Richard Trumka coming up in a few minutes from AFL-CIO. So we talk a lot about jobs and new infrastructure. But I'm just interested, if you took one net unit of oil and gas job today and compared to one net unit of solar or wind or other form of renewables, are those equal? Are they job for job, or are we going to have to do something to think through that economic and jobs equation as we make through this transition? And I'm thinking of places like West Virginia, where Joe Manchin is, or John Barrasso in Wyoming, and others, who kind of look, New Mexico, which is, as Martin Heinrich is very pro-climate, but you've got an oil and gas state, and kind of looking at the question of job transitions and what happens on that, and whether or not it may be unfair to you, but are there solutions there we need to be thinking about in terms of the job side of the oil and energy and renewables picture?
Yeah, I think that the answer is that it's when I don't know whether you can compare a specific solar project to an oil well, for example. But I think if you look at the whole, you talked about the fourth industrial revolution stuff. That's what we're going through. When you talk about the jobs and the economic activity associated with what needs to be done to get where we want to go, I think you're talking about an economic explosion. And I think that just if I could comment real quickly on the previous question, I'm going to take the under. It's going to happen way faster than people think. One reason, profits, because it's now economic to do it. People will act in their self-interest. And now that we have policy that's being thought of comprehensively versus a one-off here and a one-off there, if we provide the right sticks and carrots for businesses and individuals to make the right decisions for themselves, this will happen way quicker than people think. And I just applaud the administration's efforts to look at things holistically versus coming at it with a one-off here and a one-off there. I think that's critical moving forward.
Well, I love talking about renewables and I should say to our audience that while we have wind and hydrogen and solar and royalties and all of this being discussed, there are a lot of other things out there percolating. I mean, I'm just fascinated by on a flight back from Hawaii stuff, and my husband and I just flew back from Hawaii. The CEO of United Airlines is on there saying, by 2050 they want to be carbon zero, and they want to have carbon sequestration and biofuels flying their planes, and he's making a big commitment on that. So there are a lot of areas in this kind of renewable or less carbonized space that we could get to, but this is the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. So I want to thank Andy Marsh, President and CEO of Plug Power, Steph Spires, CEO of Solstice, thank you so much, and Frank Getman, CEO of Great Bay Renewables. I hope you'll come back. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.